Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first interview on Jodi's Silver Linings. There's a reason this interview is the first. I don't know how many of you have heard of ipDTL, but if you haven't and you're a broadcaster, a voice actor, or a podcaster, or all three, you're missing out. In Quality, the company behind ipDTL began trading as a small business startup in the UK in 2013. Its founding director and the fellow I'll be interviewing here is Kevin Leach, a former radio host and BBC sound engineer. Personally, I use ipDTL on a regular basis as an ISDN bridge. It works like a charm, and it's entirely Chrome browser-based. Plus, Kevin and his team have just introduced multi-track recording right in the browser. That's how I'm recording right now, in fact. But they also have SIP functionality and a service for call-in shows called Hybrip. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome, Kevin. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hi, Jodi. It's great to be, it's an honor to be your first ever interviewee on this podcast. How exciting.
Well, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. So I have a question for you. I have a bunch of questions for you, in fact. You've really created an amazing service, and we will certainly talk more about that. But to start with, I want to know how you became an entrepreneur. I mean, did you always know that you wanted to do your own thing, or was it just something you fell into?
It's a strange thing to describe oneself as, isn't it? I am
I guess
an
so, yeah.
entrepreneur, but yeah, I suppose I am. If you think about what that word means, it does describe me, and it's a life that I'm quite happy with. So yeah, how did it start? Well, I think I have always been. The entrepreneur lifestyle has always been attractive to me. When I was at high school, I was a DJ. I was a mobile DJ. So
Why does that not surprise me?
Yeah, when I was probably, well, let's say 14 years old, I was gathering DJ equipment and taking bookings to DJ at, I was 14 and I was going into, licensed venues, DJing 18th and 21st birthday parties and engagement parties. And of course, that led on to doing lots of weddings. So yeah, at an early age, I was already thinking about how I can sell services and make money rather than in ways other than taking on a traditional job. And then by the time I was, I guess, 19, I had several DJs working for me. So because, of course,
Wow.
I mean, the limitation of the DJ industry is that there are only 52 Saturdays in the year. You think, great, I've invested in all of this equipment and here I am and I'm available so I can be out every night earning money. And actually you realize that people only want you on a Saturday. So that there are only there are only 52 nights in a year that you can realistically charge the big money. And well, and then that means you're working every Saturday as well. And
Of
Saturday
course.
night. So it's kind of ruins your Sunday. And so I think there's a reason many people only continue that lifestyle for a while. But yeah, that was my first taste of entrepreneurship. And so I realized when there was only 52 Saturdays a year that I would have to, in order to grow the business, the only way to do it would be to get extra equipment and have additional people working for me, so that then I was acting as an agent and sending people out.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, it does. It kind of focuses a lot of the work on the weekend, which, from a lifestyle point of view, goes against the whole idea of entrepreneurship and being in control of your own life. So yeah, that was certainly my earliest memory of entrepreneurship.
So did you have influences early on? Were there any mentors or authors who wrote books that you admired or colleagues that encouraged you?
Well, I then went on to work for the BBC quite soon. I was a commercial radio host for a few years, and then I kind of drifted into the BBC. So I suppose you could say that aside from being a freelance radio host, that I left the world of entrepreneurship behind for a while. So I was a radio host, and I did things like reading travel news. And then when I joined the BBC as a travel news presenter, I got more involved in sound engineering, and I became more of a sound engineer for like BBC News Talk stations,
Sure.
BBC 5 Live, BBC Radio 4. So sitting in the studio as what you might call a board operator and a studio director, we called it.
Hmm.
So, and I'm telling you this to give you a bit of context here, really. But yeah, in my time at the BBC, the people who inspired me were those that I remember quite often the BBC would have to save money and it would decide it was going to make a saving, and the way it would make a saving would be by closing a department and getting rid of all their staff. So, for instance, you would see all of the technical trucks, the remote trucks that were going out reporting on news stories or doing radio remotes or whatever. The BBC would say, right, we're going to sell all of them now, and we're going to make all of the operators redundant. And I remember
Nice.
there were operators at the time who saw an opportunity here, and they knew that the BBC wouldn't just stop doing this kind of activity. So A, they took the redundancy. B, they bought the old trucks from the BBC, and then of course next they went and sold their services and rented the trucks back to the BBC, and of course at a far higher rate than the BBC would have been paying them in the first place.
Wow, so
And
much
of-
for
and-
savings.
Well, of course, yeah, which is, this is kind of an ongoing story, the
Yeah.
rinse and repeat cycle in, I think, probably any similar public body, but the BBC is particularly bad at this, at trying to save money and then ultimately realizing it needs to continue doing the things and find a more expensive way to do it. So yeah, I was that's quite a long way of a long way around of saying that, yeah, those people inspired me to see, to turn something that on the face of it, being made redundant from your job, on the face of it, that sounds like a terrible thing, but they saw it as an opportunity and thought, well, yeah, great, let's take our redundancy money, buy the trucks, and then go on and form our own business out of this. And it's kind of a story that I saw happen time and time again. So I can't name anybody in particular, but I did see that happen a lot. And then in terms of inspiration, I was thinking about this. There's a guy here in the UK, and of course my reference points over here in the UK.
Of course,
a lot
yeah.
of my reference points are in UK broadcasting, and the BBC gets mentioned a lot. There's a guy called Mark Goodyear who is he was a radio host on BBC Radio 1, our youth pop network, and he was very successful at a young age as a radio host. And more recently, he's been in touch with us, and he uses our services. And there's a testimonial from him on our website. So it's great to finally make contact with somebody who you admired years ago. But the reason I admired him, because he did a similar thing in that he was a radio host working within the network, employed by the BBC. And in his short time doing that job, he looked around the organization and thought, I can see there's a market there, and there's a niche that we can get involved in here. Whilst he was working there, set up his own company called Wise Buddha, which is a production company. So he sold his own services as a host back to the BBC. He then took on other hosts as an agent and sold their services back to the BBC. And then he saw that there was a market in independent production, so producing programs independently and selling them to the corporation, and making jingles and idents and selling them to the corporation.
I
And
see the
he's
pattern
now-
here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And he's now, I think when you grow a business like that, initially targeting a public corporation like that, you then build up the kudos of saying, look, we provide this public organization with services. And then the commercial independent sector
Of course.
says, wow, well, they're clearly doing a good job. And then, so then you find that you're selling to the entire market as well. And that's exactly what his company has done. And 25 years on, he's in control of this massive operation that's got loads of different departments and provide lots of different services to the broadcast industry around the world. So yeah, Mark, we've never met, but we've spoken recently. I would certainly say is an inspiration as an entrepreneur, because he really just saw the opportunities and nothing held him back. He just ran with them.
Yeah, I could see how that would be inspirational.
Yeah.
So you started ipDTL out of what need? What need did you see? And did you have some challenges with that along the way?
Well, funnily enough, the reference point here is once again when I was working at the BBC
Mhm.
as a board operator. Like I say, the main network that I was working on was called is called Radio 5 Live. It's the BBC's news and sport network, and until recently only available on AM. And AM in this country has always sounded particularly bad. But so
Okay.
there's something to be said for the content of that station that they've
Mhm.
always managed to be successful before digital broadcasting. We've got what we call DAB digital radio, which is kind of
Mhm.
the equivalent of HD radio over here, and it's kind of European standard. Now that station is available, and of course you can listen online and through apps
Mhm.
on your phone. But for many years it was on this awful flaky AM frequency, and it would fade in and out as you went under tunnels and bridges and things.
Yeah.
Anyway, I spent a lot of time there as a board operator, and the more that we moved away from this scratchy old AM medium platform onto, like I say, web streaming and digital radio, the more it was necessary to move away from connecting to guests on scratchy old phone lines. But we
Mhm.
still
Yeah.
did a lot of this, and they still do a lot of this. It's a news and sports station, so a lot of their content is soccer commentary. So they'll send out ball by ball commentators who travel the length and breadth of the country and the continent, reporting back on soccer games.
Mhm.
And they still, to this day, are carrying these old. In fact, I'm looking at one now. So it looks like something that's like old wartime technology, something out of the Ark. It's an old metal hand-built ISDN audio codec made by a company called Glen Sound here in the UK, who are another
Mhm.
company actually who saw a market and really ran with it. Now they still use these things. The commentators turn up at the soccer ground, and they need a physical ISDN line to which to connect this clunky old equipment, which is
Mhm.
a digital phone line, which has been around for about 30 years now. And they plug it into this line. They cross their fingers that it works, and they dial a phone number, a digital phone number, which rings an equivalent line at the studio, who's got an equivalent piece of equipment. And by some miracle, it connects the call between both locations. It's called an ISDN call. I mean, ISDN is used for other things as well. You know, the military
Mhm.
use it for communication, and banks
And
use it for
voice acting, yeah.
secure communications, and voiceovers. Voice talent
Mhm.
use it for connecting to their client studios, and have done for many years. But of course, it means
Mhm.
having a physical line installed in your house, and it's very expensive. The biggest
Sometimes you can't get it.
well, and that's becoming more and more of an issue. The biggest
Mhm.
telecoms provider in the USA, AT&T, are rapidly pushing the prices up and encouraging their customers in quite a ruthless way, really, to migrate from the technology, just by saying either we're turning it off or we're putting your bill up, an obscene amount.
Yeah.
You're over there on the eastern edge of Canada, near the US border. What's the deal for you there? Are you without the ability to get an ISDN line now?
It depends on where you are. Where I am right now, near Toronto, you can get them in Toronto still, but you would have a really hard time getting them north of the city or, like, outside of the city proper,
Right.
um, just because they just don't build them anymore. It's not like they're putting them in.
Yeah. So likewise, the telecoms company there, they've got little interest in selling you this service, I imagine.
Mhm, yeah.
So I was at this BBC talk station where they still do and have been using this old-fashioned technology, using what's known as the G722 codec, which gives you a fairly scratchy sounding
Mm.
audio, fairly scratchy sounding voice, by compared to what we're talking on now, which is an ipDTL connection using the Opus codec. There's a massive difference in terms of bandwidth there, and therefore how much of my voice you can hear compared to
Mhm.
how well you can hear these football commentators, soccer commentators.
Well, right now you're coming
Um,
in loud and clear, so
well, I'm glad to hear that.
yeah.
So I would sit in the studio at BBC Radio 5 Live, listening to all this shoddy quality audio coming in on scratchy phone lines and things, and
You're so
thinking,
polite. I'd use a different word.
there's got to be a better way to do this. And I mean, we were talking before we started the recording here about how standards today are strained. You know, on the one hand, you've got people who have expensive hi-fi equipment in their home, and they want everything to be perfect and separate equipment and great big floor-standing speakers and things. And then in the next room, you've got your kids listening to music coming out of the tiny little speaker on the bottom of a cell phone. So there are both extremes there, and I think. To an extent, radio listeners just put up and have got used to putting up with whatever quality they are given. But I wasn't happy with that. I've never been happy with that. As I guess I am a bit of an audiophile myself. I don't have massively expensive hi-fi equipment, but I want stuff to sound decent. And I think, you know, from a kind of aspirational point of view, from a broadcaster's point of view, why wouldn't you want your product to sound as good as you possibly can?
Oh, totally.
So I was sitting there day after day in this studio thinking that there's got to be a better way to do this. And I looked around for alternatives to this ISDN technology, and there were a few around. Comrex, of course, have been building technology, hardware codecs that do this across the internet for some time. The key thing there being that they use the internet as their connection, so that you don't need these old ISDN lines. There's an app called Lucy Live, which has been around for some years now, which does a similar thing. It's a little bit clunky, and there are various restrictions to how you can use that, and then you have issues with firewalls with all of these things in connecting between them. And I suppose the entrepreneur inside me was thinking about how I could escape the BBC and go back to my entrepreneurial roots, and how I might be able to exploit the internet and emerging technologies. And I just happened to be browsing around looking for what I might use to set up some kind of company. I was actually thinking from an entrepreneurial point of view, I was actually thinking, is there a business in going around and installing equipment for regular radio contributors? So people who are reviewing the newspapers every week, or people who, you know, whenever there's a breaking news story on, you know, let's say, heaven forbid, there's a air disaster, the go-to person who the radio station calls and says, with the, you know, there's been this crash. Can we talk to you about you know, can we hypothesize about how this might have happened, even though we know absolutely nothing at this stage. That's normally how it goes. Yeah. So these kind of people who are called upon regularly, and political pundits and all of these people, is there a business in installing equipment in these people's homes and offices that they can use that's more cost effective than this ISDN technology to connect to the radio station? So I was looking around for the equipment, and
it sounds like that would be kind of like your DJing days, though, right? Like there's only so many hours you can work in a day.
Yes,
so
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it actually, my initial business model, the flaw in it was that it required me to be by my cell phone 24/7, so that whenever somebody needed to be on air, I would have to connect into and this happened, I would connect into the computer that I'd installed in their house, and I would physically do the back end work to connect that computer through to the computer at the radio station. And we tried it for, we've got a kind of Fox News equivalent station here called Sky News, although slightly more impartial. And they do, you know, like a rolling CNN style news service. And we did experiment quite a few times putting these people on air using a camera in their home as well, and an earpiece and stuff, and it worked fairly well. But trying to change the culture, and maybe we'll go on to talk a little bit about this, about trying to change the culture of how these things are working, and again sending trucks out to contributors was quite difficult and slow. So a lot of that was shelved. Anyway, long story short, if I can manage to trim it down a little bit, I was browsing online to try and find technology that we could use for this, and I was looking at this Lucy Live app and a few other things. Connection Open, which actually is is now has been coming to fruition. It feels like forever, but it feels like they're slowly bringing a product to market there.
Mhm.
And I looked at these various services, and nothing quite ticked all the boxes. Always reliable enough, or cost effective enough, or flexible enough. And then I stumbled upon a technology known as WebRTC. Now, you may never have heard, you've probably heard of WebRTC, but the listener has probably never heard of WebRTC.
So what is that?
Yes, it is a crucial building block for our product, ipDTL. And it's the protocol, it's the framework which the companies that are now providing similar services to ipDTL, SessionLink Pro, Source Connect now, Clean Feed, what one seems to be born every minute right now. These services are all using this technology, which is built into the web browser called WebRTC. RTC is real-time communication, and web, well, it's web. So web real-time communication, and it's how I'm talking to you now, despite the fact you're over there on the east coast of Canada, and I'm here in the United Kingdom, looking out of the window on a beautiful green Yorkshire rural scene. You'd never believe it, because we're talking almost in real time. We're not doing that thing where we're talking over each other and we keep interrupting each other, which is often an issue with such digital services across distance. And it's amazing. It's allowed us to develop our service, ipDTL, and it's allowed a lot of innovation for similar services. And Google Hangouts uses it to an extent now, and there are various other services that are using this framework in the web browser it's got several crucial elements. One is this Opus codec that I mentioned, which is, think of it similar to MP3. It's a way of compressing high quality audio so that it can travel across the internet efficiently. So the Opus codec is in there. It's got the ability to handshake, if you like, to your computer says to mine, I would like to connect to you. And it tells, your computer tells mine its IP address, mine tells yours its IP address, and they agree how to connect and handshake across the internet. So it's got those elements. And then the fact that it's built into the web browser. So it's there in everybody's Google Chrome. Nobody has to install any software. It just works. And the other crucial element is that it negotiates seamlessly. I talked about the IP addresses. It negotiates seamlessly through the firewall. You don't need to know what's going on there. I don't need to know what's going on there. That negotiation just happens, and because you've got this firewall in your router, in your internet router or router from your internet service provider, which does a very important job. It stops hackers and criminals from hacking into your computer and your home network. It prevents people from getting in and being able to see your computer and your transactions and your personal data and the rest of it. So that's a very important job. However, it can be really troublesome when you're trying to connect a service such as ipDTL, because it sees the traffic coming in and says, "Well, no, of course I'm not gonna let you through." That would be absurd. Well, this does a very good job of negotiating that, and it sends the data out first, and then because it goes out on a certain path, it can come back in on a certain path, and it's doing all this magic in the background, which is kind of very tedious if you're not interested in this kind of thing. But it's also very important in making a service like this work. So all of those elements allowed us to produce ipDTL on a shoestring, and we really did launch this service on a shoestring. There were no investors, and I didn't have buckets of cash in the bank. In fact, I remember drawing money on credit cards and things, and using a bank overdraft to start this company. So it's not like I went out and got a load of venture capitalists or anything like that. It was really done on a shoestring. And in the early days, everything that we wanted to do, the first question was, well, can we afford it? What's it going to cost, and how can we do it for next to nothing? And we really did. We ran the business. We still run the business on next to nothing. It's not like it's a massive money spinner, and we've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in, and that we can have big plush offices and a team of staff. It's a small niche company, and there's myself and my business partner, and we continue to operate on a shoestring. And I think that's part of why we've managed to be so successful, is that we continue to do things apart from, we're extravagant once in a while with trade shows and things, but generally we do everything on a really tight budget, and that's how the company has managed to evolve to where it is today, I think.
Well, I imagine that having a smaller company means that you can pivot. You can do things differently if you need to on a, no kind of leeway. You can just go and do what you want.
Yeah, and the risk is low.
That's true.
If you want to try adding another service, our niche now with ipDTL, because like I say, there are other services that have come along and done very similar things now, where we've got a couple of niches. One is SIP, which we can come on to talk about, and the other is, we talked about this ISDN service, this crazy thing where you need a digital phone line and dedicated hardware, and you carry the equipment around, or you install it in your home, and the phone companies are charging stupid amounts of money for it. Well, it is still in use in the broadcast and voice and audio production industries, as you well know. And I know
unfortunately.
that you actually use this service yourself. You mentioned this in your introduction. We've got this ISDN bridging service. So what we've done is kind of glue the old technology onto the new technology, so that we can bridge it in the middle. So from this service on your computer with a web browser, you can have your own ISDN number that people dial, or you can dial out to people's ISDN lines. And it's as if you do have this old ISDN service without all of the cost and hassle of having it installed. So we've got this nice niche now, which we were able to launch pretty easily. I mean, there were some challenges, but it was my point is that myself and my business partner could scratch our heads between us and say, well, why don't we try this? And we literally, bought some bits of kit and tried plugging them together and rented a small space in a local internet co-location data center. And it was literally a quarter rack, a quarter of one of those racks that you see in a server room. We rented that and installed our equipment in it and said, well, let's just see if it works. And this was here in the UK, and we tried it and it didn't work. And then we tried it again and it still didn't work. And then we tried it again and it sort of worked. And then we got to the stage that it did work. And then we were able to gradually roll that out and install similar equipment in the USA. We've now got our main servers in Dallas, Texas. Our other ISDN bridging location is in Denver, Colorado, and we've got several servers in these locations and lots of physical ISDN lines coming in and out, which is, there's a lot of infrastructure to stay on top of, especially when it's in the wrong country, it's a different country to where you're based. So, but we were able to build all of this up gradually, and each time we had a little bit of success, we could plow that money back into rolling out the services further. And like you say, it's low risk, and it allows you to be quite creative in your approach, I think, when you don't have to talk to investors and say, we'd like to do this, but it's going to cost X amount of dollars. And they've got to put faith in the idea. And then what happens if it doesn't work? It's a really nice way to run a business, and it's scary at times. And sometimes things don't work as well as you expect them to. But, things have, touch wood, things have gone, have been surprisingly seamless to date, and the technology is most of the time runs reliably. And I'm rambling.
That's okay. Why don't you tell me about SIP? So this is a new product that you have just put out?
Yeah, SIP. People always want to know what these things stand for, and it's a bit like.
Well, I'm curious too, because I have very little experience with it. So yeah,
we should just go back on these things. ipDTL is Internet Protocol down the line. IP, IP technology is what drives the world now. So if you don't know what IP stands for, you've been living under a rock. So that's the IP part. Down the line is down the line. I am talking to you down the line, the virtual line, across the internet. So that's ipDTL. ISDN is, there should be a glossary for this, shouldn't there?
Yeah, there
ISDN
should. Yeah,
is Integrated Services Digital Network. Now,
and
what
that's
does
through
that
copper
mean?
wire, right?
Yeah, it is. Like a traditional phone line from the late 1800s. So what does that mean? Integrated services, digital network. It means nothing, doesn't it? So, and likewise, SIP. It's nice to know what it means, but it means nothing. Session Initiation Protocol. It hardly rolls off the tongue, but what it means is it's for establishing phone calls. And if you work in a modern office, if you're listening to this podcast now in a modern office rather than doing your work, good on you. You've probably got a digital VoIP phone, voice over IP phone on your desk. The chances are that that's running SIP. That's based on SIP, and SIP is the protocol that's being used to connect that phone call, your phone call from that device to another phone call in the building or elsewhere in the world. So that's what SIP is. It's actually a very common technology which is being used on billions of devices around the world in offices the world over.
So how does that tie into ipDTL?
Well, SIP can also be used for professional broadcast and for professional audio. So, for instance, the only difference between the SIP call that I just described between two offices and a SIP call that we might be having now between us across the internet is the codec. They're using a scratchy old codec. G711 is the classic codec that runs voice phone calls, and we're using the Opus codec, and that's the only difference. The protocol for establishing the call is the same. It just uses a higher bandwidth, higher quality codec to transmit the audio, to transmit the voice. So we can use SIP in the professional audio world to make a call such as we have now between two compatible devices. Well, why do we need that? I hear you ask, when you've already got ipDTL and it does the job perfectly well. Well, we are about openness and interoperability and anti-monopoly. We don't want to be the company that controls every professional audio connection in the world. I couldn't handle the pressure, to be honest with you. For a small company like us, that would be a lot of responsibility. We're far more about promoting interconnectivity between devices made by different manufacturers. We talked earlier about Comrex. There's Tieline. There's the Lucy Live app, which we talked about. There are many of these devices and apps now coming on the market. AEQ, Digigram, and many more. There seem to be. If I'm going to the IBC show, which is a trade show in Amsterdam in a few weeks, and there'll be loads of these devices that support SIP and support the Opus codec. So
if you're using SIP, is it like super easy to use on your cell phone? Is that why this is becoming more of a thing?
There's a cell phone app called Linphone. In fact, there are several cell phone apps, but there's one called Linphone, which is free, which is compatible with our SIP.audio service. There's Lucy Live, which we talked about earlier, which is higher quality and allows you to connect an external microphone. That can be run on your cell phone. So you can connect from these apps on your cell phone to ipDTL, or you can connect from these apps on your cell phone to the devices that we mentioned by Comrex or AEQ or whoever. My point being, it gives you a central standard connectivity protocol which all of these devices support. So instead of saying, in the audio production industry right now, there's a company called Source Elements, who you could say are one of our competitors, and they've been very successful. They've produced a bit of software called Source Connect, and a lot of studios are adopting it now for connecting between voice production and audio production studios, which is great, but it does create a bit of a monopoly, doesn't it? What happens if such a company put their prices up, or what happens if the heaven forbid, the company were to fail overnight? All of these businesses and voice talent and the rest who have invested and if you like, put all their eggs in that basket of that particular product. What happens if that product either ceases to be, or if the prices skyrocket? So whilst it's a great service that they've got there, and it's proven to be very successful, I would encourage Source Elements to include the SIP capability within their products, and I would encourage any company who are making devices or apps for connecting, as we are, across the internet for high quality audio production, to include this SIP protocol. Therefore, a service such as SIP.audio, which is the service that we are now promoting and selling, which is a subscription service, will allow you to create those connections between those devices, but also other SIP providers who are selling SIP services can also sell those services, and therefore nobody is getting tied into one particular service. And you've got a system, therefore, in the future. Jody, when you say to me, Kevin, will you be on my podcast? I can say, sure, my address is kevin@sip.audio. There's no other conversation to be had. You don't need to know what technology I'm using, whether I'm using a Comrex, ipDTL, or an app on my phone. You simply go to your SIP client, type in that address, and you can connect to me. So that's where I see the future, and that's why now we are putting our focus and efforts on that product.
That makes sense. So I think we're pretty much coming to the end here, but if there's anything else that you'd like to mention before we go, I'd love to hear it.
Only that I wish you great success with this new venture of yours, and again how pleased I am to be and honoured I am to be your first interviewee, and I hope that something has inspired somebody. You know, if one little thing that I've said has inspired somebody, then that's enough, right?
Sure. Is there a particular way that people can get in touch with you if they would like to talk about those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the social media platforms, you can find us at Inquality Media on Twitter, or you can go to our support site, support.inqualitymedia.com, or even easier than all of that, send an email to support@ipdtl.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate your coming on here.
Thanks, Jody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for those silver linings. Until next time.